All the Java textbooks say that every class has to have a constructor, yet we can write classes without constructors. What exactly are the rules? Let's take a look. Luckily, there's really just two rules that we need to know to understand when the Java compiler will add a constructor and what type of constructor it will be. The first rule is Java will only add a constructor if the class's Java source code does not include a constructor, and the type of constructor it will add will always be the default constructor, or the no argument constructor. To better understand these rules, we're going to look at three example classes. And in these classes, they're very simple classes that either have a single constructor or no constructor. And we've called the classes the names of cat A, cat B, and cat C. And cat A has no constructor in the source, cat B has the default constructor, and cat C has a single argument specific constructor. What we want to know from this example and what we want to take away is, will the Java compiler add the default constructor to either cat A or cat C? So in other words, if you create an object, the cat C object, using the default constructor, will it actually compile? And also what we want to know is, what exactly does the default constructor that the Java compiler adds, what does it look like? So to understand that, we'll now go to the code example. So we're going to look at our code example now, and we're going to start with the implementation class, testcat. And all this class does is create three cat objects. Each of them use a separate cat class. The first cat class, cat A, calls the default constructor at object creation time. Cat B also calls the default constructor. And cat C calls a one parameter constructor. Now there is a difference between cat A and cat B, and that is that if you look at cat A, we don't have a constructor explicitly written, but Java should insert a default constructor if there is no constructor there. Cat B, on the other hand, we've explicitly put a default constructor. There's nothing inside the constructor though. And then if we look at cat C, we can see that cat C also has a constructor, but it's a one parameter constructor, and it just calls the mutator, which sets the instance variable. And all of these three classes, the only thing they have are a mutator and accessor. So we compile the code, check, we don't have any errors, and now we're going to run the debugger and see what happens. So we run the debugger in the first object creation, and we see that when we step into it, the debugger just highlights the class name, and then it returns back, and we can see over here that the object cat A has been created with an object ID number of 433. For the object lowercase cat B, it calls the constructor, and we can see that it's calling our default constructor that doesn't do anything, and then it simply steps through and returns. And then for cat C, when it calls the one parameter constructor, we can see that it calls that one parameter constructor here, and then simply calls the mutator, sets the instance variable, and returns. So this code all operated, and it created three separate cat objects using three separate cat classes. One thing that we see that if we validated that if we don't put a constructor, Java automatically inserts a default constructor. One thing we don't know is that for cat C, where we've put a one parameter constructor, could we also call a default constructor even though we don't have one here? Will Java actually insert a default constructor? So we can try that out. We'll first end the program, and then we're going to uncomment the line and see if it actually creates default constructor. And if we look, we get an error, and it says error constructor cat C in class cat C cannot be applied to the given type. if we create a constructor, a one-parameter constructor or any constructor, Java will not automatically insert the default constructor. And so we can never call this unless we also added a default constructor. So we have to go back to the code to get it to compile again. So the previous version. We save it, and then we just build it, and we make sure everything compiles. But there's still an outstanding question, and that is, if we look at our constructor for cat B, our default constructor, we see that we didn't do anything here. Now, how would that compare to the constructor that Java automatically inserts for cat A? Is it also not doing anything? Would it look just like this? The only way we can find out is to actually take the Java class file and decompile it. And here's an example of this. So we're using, if you have the JDK installed, we're using the Java P program, which will decompile the Java class file, and then it will spit out the bytecode. And all we're doing here is we're having it spit out the instructions and put private variables and some other information. We specify the class file, and then we tell it to, instead of outputting it to the screen, we're going to output it to this text file, which we'll then open. So this is similar to if you compiled a program in C and you wanted to disassemble it and look at the assembly code. So this bytecode is the assembly code for Java. We run this, and now we're going to run this for cat B, and what we want to do is open both of these and see, since we know the Java compiler inserted a constructor for cat A, we want to see how it compares with the bytecode values for cat B. We run this, we've created the two class files, text files, and now we're going to run Notepad, and then we'll see if we see what they look like. So we'll first open the cat A, and now we'll open cat B. We can actually minimize this now. So if we compare the two, cat A on top and cat B on the bottom, we'll actually start first with cat B because we know what that constructor looks like. We wrote it. It didn't have anything in there. And if we look at what the bytecode is, and these three lines here are the bytecode. There's a load 0, an invoke special, and then a return. Now, clue as to what this invoke special is, which may seem a little odd because we just had the open bracket and close bracket with nothing inside. But what this actually is a call to the parent of the cat B class, and the parent of the cat B class is object. Object is the parent of all Java classes. And so here it's actually calling using the super command, which we didn't put in but the Java compiler inserted, and it will call the object, and we'll have another lecture about that. But if we look at cat A, where we didn't insert a constructor, we can see that what Java inserted here is the exact same thing as cat B. It's the same instruction. So the default constructor that the Java compiler will insert is simply a constructor with two brackets and then a hidden call with using super, or you could specify the super. And that concludes the code example. So to summarize the code example, we can see that cat A, which had no constructor in the source code, had 3 bytecode instructions for the compiler inserted constructor. Cat B, where we had an empty constructor in the source code, had the same 3 bytecode instructions. Therefore, we can tell that Java, the compiler, is basically just inserting an empty constructor into cat A. In contrast, cat C, where we actually do something with the constructor, we can see some additional bytecode instructions where it's calling the mutator. Another point of interest is this invoke special. And we can see the invoke special is not only in cat A, but cat B and cat C. And this is some more behind the scenes work that goes on even in the constructors that we write, where the Java compiler calls the super command, which the keyword, which we'll talk about when we talk about inheritance. And here basically it's allowing the constructor to call its parent constructor. In this case it's the object class for Java. A great way to summarize the discussion is to see if you can answer the following questions. So first, will the Java compiler add a default constructor to cat A and cat C? And the answer is only for cat A. Why? Because it'll only add a default constructor to cat A because all classes need a constructor in Java, but none were included in the source. And the Java compiler will not add a constructor to cat C because cat C already includes a constructor, that specific constructor. Now if cat C was written with only the specific constructor, can an object be created without any parameters? No. Java compiler will not add a default constructor to cat C. Why? Because there already exists a constructor. So if any other constructors exist within the class, the Java compiler will not add. And if you try to create an object using the default constructor where you don't have a default constructor but have another constructor, the code won't compile. So what does the default constructor, which the Java compiler added, look like? Well, it looks the same as the default constructor for cat B. The constructor only calls its parent class object in this case.